On this podcast, you'll find interviews with high-performing, successful individuals in life sciences. On a weekly basis, we cover their proven methods, principles, strategies, and mindsets to implement new technologies that scale to meet the needs of people in our world.
Hello and welcome to the Life Science Success Podcast. Today we're going to be talking about artificial intelligence. For those of you who are new to watching the podcast, my name is Don, and I'm a consultant in life sciences. I help companies scale and manage complexity and also increase their performance. Today I have a distinguished panel of guests with me to speak about artificial intelligence, and I look forward to having a deeper discussion about key topics in the space and any key challenges as well along the way. So with that, let me first introduce Dusty Majumdar. So Dusty, could you go through a quick introduction of yourself?
Yeah, sure, Don. Great to be back with you. Really appreciate the invite to this great forum. I've been in the healthcare and biopharma area for almost 20 plus years now. Worked in companies like GE Healthcare, IBM Watson Health, Exact Sciences, consult a lot with AI related startups in the Boston and the New York City area at the moment. And I was fortunate to see AI kind of from its inception around 8 to 10 years ago, and there was a lot of hype around the application of AI in healthcare to where it's now, and looking forward to talking about some of my experiences.
Perfect. And up next, we have Mark Collins. So Mark, could you do a quick introduction of yourself?
Yeah, again, thanks again for the opportunity, Don. Very nice to be along with you and the rest of the panel. So my background is life sciences. I've been in life sciences for now 30 years. I guess I first came across AI in the 1980s when it was first supposed to save the world. And since then, I've really had a career that's spanned, pharmaceutical companies, life science companies, Boehringer Ingelheim, Thermo Fisher, and so on. And really always with an application of how can we use informatics, bioinformatics, and machine learning to really augment the way we do drug discovery and get drugs to patients more quickly and more efficiently.
Perfect. And last but not least, Yannick Kowalski. So Yannick, can you please introduce yourself?
Sure. And thanks for having me back. So my name is Janik. I live in Germany, live and work in Germany. I'm an engineer turned entrepreneur. I have an academic background in cognitive computer science and intelligence systems, with a heavy focus on natural language processing. And for the past 6 years, I've been trying to find ways to make that useful in life sciences with my company, with our company, Simolytics. We essentially work on or way of trying to find ways to use AI and natural language processing to identify unmet needs in patient populations by understanding better what and how patients actually converse about what it means to be ill, what it means to have a chronic disease, and what challenges exist. And we try to find ways to infuse that through AI, through using AI to infuse that into patient centricity and into modern drug development. I lead the company as its CEO and as its product architect, which allows me to combine really what I did in academia with these past 6 years of experience in working with pharmaceutical companies.
Perfect. So to first kick us off, I just have one early on question here that I wanted to ask. So, in your view, can you give us the lay of the land with regards to artificial intelligence today? I was looking up some statistics recently, and essentially I saw, in 2014 that there were 664 million AI applications at that point in time. Now there's 6.7 billion AI applications in 2021. And what I thought was, maybe why don't we go first to Mark with this question, and ask that you just, give us your perspective in terms of, where do you think we stand today?
I think, obviously that's an amazing statistic for a start, right? It depends how many of those are actually, being applied and being productive and being useful. I think that's what it comes down to, right? And I think certainly throughout my career, it's always been a case of, well, there's an awful lot of hype around machine learning and AI in general. How do we translate that into actually something that's useful? And I think that's, where we are today. And I think since the last probably 3 to 5 years, we've seen a convergence that really makes the possibility of really using AI and it being a benefit to life sciences a reality. And that convergence really comes down to really good algorithms, right? That we, that really push the boundaries of what machines learning can be. We have a rise in we are almost unlimited computing power at our disposal. When I first started doing machine learning, you had to put a specific processor board inside your PC to even train the network. Um, but that's a long time ago. That's like the 1980s, right? And then we also have an explosion in data generation, right? So we from high throughput platforms like next generation sequencing, but also from the digitization of healthcare, we really do have those three things. Um, I think along with that probably comes a fourth aspect, which is governance and ethics. And I know we may get into that a little bit later on, but I think also there's a realization that it is going to come. It is going to play a very important part of our future in healthcare, and therefore we need, to give it that convergence, which allows us to do things that are really useful. We also have to think of how we how we govern, how we build these algorithms, so we don't build them with bias in and so on. So I think we're at a really interesting spot, and I think the hype is to a certain extent justified if we can find the right applications or the applications that are going to make the most impact.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, to go back to that, the big numbers there, right? I don't know how many of those are chatbots or, or are actually providing any level of quantum computing. But what I thought was, maybe we can go next to Dusty for a little bit more, of your thoughts in terms of, where do we stand today with AI?
Yeah, Don, I've mentioned this to you before. First, I wish it was not called artificial intelligence. It's an old term, which seems to indicate that machines are about to take over. I prefer the term that Mark used, augmented intelligence, a little while ago, which sounds more like augmenting human intelligence or brain power, right? And we are all familiar with the hype that was started around 8 to 10 years ago. This is the third hype cycle for AI, by the way. Gartner was the previous one in the 80s, and there was one in the 50s. So now you have the third hype cycle, which really caused a lot of disillusionment in the healthcare and life sciences arena. Gartner calls this the trough of disillusionment, and we're kind of there right now for the initial hype. But I think we are making progress in coming up with some real applications. And look, for any technology, there is always a little bit of hype. And in this case, driven by the tech companies, the hype was just unprecedented. Now, if you go back to 2003, when Francis Collins and Craig Venter announced to the world that they have completed the Human Genome Project, right? The comments, if you look back at the headlines in New York Times or Wall Street Journal, it talked about solving the mysteries of life, and by 2010, we're going to eradicate cancer. It was similar, in 2012, 2013, 2014, when, all these companies, they jumped into the fray, mostly tech companies, and started talking about eradicating cancer and winning the war on cancer and whatnot. And now I think we are at a stage where the hype's getting mitigated. We are coming up with some real applications, and we are still not where we need to be, anywhere near where we need to be in clinical care. So if you take a population, right, of 330 million in the US, right, let's say roughly 10% of them need care on a daily basis. So that's around 30 million. And if you ask the question, for how many of these 30 million people is their care guided by AI? The answer is a small, minuscule number, maybe 0.001% or something. But AI is taking root more among the translational and the operational processes, where it should be. It should solve the easy problems before it starts tackling cancer. And it's still pretty low in clinical care, but that's what this decade that we are in is going to see the transformation in.
Yeah, I think back to a lot of those statements that you made, Dusty, and I think we oftentimes seem to underestimate just the overall challenge that's ahead of us, right? It's just amazing to me that, whenever we see the technology, we get anxious about, what it might be able to do, but at the same time, especially in healthcare, there are a lot of different challenges that you have to overcome, many of which we'll touch on today, I think, in the overall discussion. So next, Yannick, so give us your lay of the land in AI today.
I think the argument that this last hype wave is kind of over is spot on. I think we're increasingly looking at a more pragmatic landscape of industrial scale use cases that work quite well, that have spawned a large number of not similar but similarly inspired application cases. And I think a lot of these, the statistics that you shared, they are very similar but applied to different use cases. And that's a great outcome, actually, because you have to first understand what actually does work, what can you build upon, and how can you then improve. And I think one of the things that we have identified as a problem and that needs to be improved is that AI is good at solving very narrow problems that have been trained on high volumes of data that are almost artificial problems, and the algorithms that solve these problems don't know what they're solving or why they're solving it. So they're largely blind to the context, which prohibits these systems to become useful in a lot of day-to-day situations, because the reality just is profoundly more complex than we can currently cover with training data or with modeling algorithms and modeling the decision space itself. So I think we're on the verge of that shifting, and that will likely maybe in the next 10, 20 years will open up more let's say end user opportunities for AI. So I think that sums up where I think we are with what's currently possible, what has been proven, what's yet to be done.
Yeah, so I just
if I may jump in for just a second and reiterate what Yannick just said. Clinical burnout is a huge issue today among clinicians, and if AI can reduce the clinical burnout among physicians, and that's where the focus really should be at this early stage. Not unraveling the mysteries of complex diseases right away. We're working towards it, but if you can reduce the keyboard time for clinicians, use machines to detect errors, harness data to improve outcomes in clinical decision support, and give clinicians and patients back the gift of time, that should be the initial goal. And Eric Topol and others have talked about this. And just wanted to reiterate what Yannick said. It's so true.
It's perfect. Even mundane things like documentation and making sure that next few steps in the line aren't human tasks anymore, because they don't. If we're honest, they don't have to be, and that we can probably design systems that do a lot of that and just allow physicians to invest that time into the relationship with patients, or just give them time back to begin with.
Yeah, I mean, I'll make a little comment. I mean, I think again to the point about what can we do to augment clinicians, uh, to the point that Yannick and Dusty made. I think is really where we'll see the most sort of bang for our machine learning buck, as it were, is really you know in the business that I work in now, econometrics. We're using machine learning and AI to really augment the radiologist, to read MRI scans more accurately, more quantifiably, more quickly, not to take decision making away from clinicians, but to augment them and make them scalable and make them, be able to spend more time with the patient because they're not, poring over an MRI scan looking for a lesion, or counting lesions by hand. So I think that's where we'll see the most opportunity, and I think the most adoption, because we're not. It's then AI isn't seen as threatening; it's seen as just another tool that I can use to because as humans we're great at making tools and using them, right? So this is just another tool to help me in my daily work, like a stethoscope is, or we're always augmenting clinicians with robot surgery to and laparoscopic surgery and so on. They're all tools that I think help them deliver better patient care, which is what we should be focused on.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to transition maybe to our second question here. So, I mean, the way I wanted to kind of tee this one up, and I know people can read it as it scrolls across here, but when I go to the doctor, the interesting part to me, and I know Eric Topol talks about this as well, is that you instantly have a physician when you go to the family doctor in the U.S. that turns away from you and focuses on typing into the computer the things that you're saying. They update your medical history. They ask you for things that you're currently feeling and things like that. And it totally disconnects you from this patient physician kind of experience. On the flip side of that, where you could maybe use, artificial intelligence to help maybe capture some of the information or even help feed them some of the things, I know that there's a lot of skepticism, overall, that physicians are afraid of AI. I actually was on a panel that's currently working on post-production activities. Where I was, trying to answer this very question, but how do we get to a point where AI will gain, more credibility and trust amongst physicians? And Dusty, why don't I come first to you in this round?
Sure, Don. Something that you said, obviously resonates with me quite a bit. Where, today, if you just think about the world of imaging, CT, MRI, X-ray, there's an astounding statistic here that in medical imaging, 30% of the scans have false negatives. So think about that. Physicians are missing lesions at this point, features, radiological features, which they potentially could use to diagnose the patient. Now, if AI can actually dramatically reduce the extent of false negatives, right, or in other words, find lesions or features of clinical importance that you may miss, that could change the game. We see similar things in colonoscopy as well. As you know, I was involved with colorectal cancer a little bit, and AI in randomized trials in colonoscopy has shown that it can actually augment significantly the human capacity to identify these smaller polyps that they miss. Just last week, or was it this week? This week, actually, at RSNA, the big show in Chicago that came back this year, right? After a year of doing it virtually. Um, MRI scans, which used AI, reconstructed images, reconstructed 65 to 75% faster with significant benefits in image quality. So, as we all know, the claustrophobia inside an MRI, and if AI can reduce that significantly, that's a huge benefit. So, from that standpoint, AI can actually improve the relationships patients have with clinicians, their primary care doctor. It can reduce burnout. It can give radiologists the gift of time so that they can spend time doing value-added stuff. But the other part of gaining credibility and trust really is, what is actually AI? AI is a set of algorithms which are based on some probabilistic measure being trained on a training set. Now, the question is the training set that the AI algorithm has been trained on appropriate for the patient in front of you? Is the training set providing you the geographical diversity, the ethnical diversity, the gender diversity that you need for the accurate output of the algorithm to diagnose the illness of the patient, or to propose treatment? And that's a key question today, because if you look at clinical trials in the US, we are doing clinical trials mostly with Caucasian patients, healthier patients than what would typically have those diseases, and mostly male patients. So it doesn't really represent the larger population. So we need to build it. A third point, which we'll come back to probably, in the remaining time that we have for this conversation, is this whole concept of the black box. We don't know what's inside the black box of a lot of these algorithms, and it creates this uncomfortable situation for physicians and patients that cannot tell which features the machine uses to generate its prediction. So without a thorough understanding of how AI is working, it's going to be difficult to assuage the fears among the general population of these runaway machines, which have been stoked by movies like the Terminator or the Matrix, or what have you, right? And we have to get over that. We have to make the black box a white box, at least a little bit more transparent box. And explainability and transparency in these algorithms is of paramount importance to generate trust among clinicians and patients down the line. And we can talk more when we come back to some of the specifics in these topics.
Yeah, and so really quickly before I pass it off to Yannick, Sanghamitra Sen says hello from Austin, Texas as well. So she's watching also. So Yannick, I guess what are your thoughts in terms of what is it going to take to get to a point where AI will gain credibility and trust?
Yeah, Dusty, I really had to smile because I was actually on a stage in Germany and someone asked me, would you let AI diagnose you? And I knew this. I knew the same statistics back then, and I just quickly replied, "Yes, of course." And there was just a gasp in the room, and 100 people not understanding. It's like, "What? How dare you?" Right? But then I went on to explain that actually, what you explained, physicians make a lot of mistakes, and algorithms look at more features. They look at more aspects. That's what they're made for, and they can really serve. They can really serve physicians just with diagnosis with a lot of these aspects. But on a very fundamental level, we need to consider that AI makes errors just as humans do. We don't. If someone walks into an OR and says, "This is actually my first day, good luck," we'll probably run screaming. But if we get the impression that the human is a professional, then we tend to trust. And currently, AI systems, they make errors that are kind of obvious to us, and that, in our view, often makes them naive and stupid, if you will. And this hurts trust, and it should hurt trust. AI needs to, not just in the medical context, needs to show consistent success over time. This automatically results into trust and credibility. And this is actually not something that we should seek to increase artificially. Love that you touched upon training data, because that's just very, very true, that AI as an outcome needs to demonstrate that it's beneficial to humans and not malicious, that it is explicable, transparent, and to an extent also just, and that it acts autonomously. And this all starts with good training data. And we need to make sure that this training data doesn't contain malicious elements, that it is representative and complete. And in the end, that will that will yield good products, and good products don't tend to not need to be explained. Art trying to artificially increase their perception usually is also a little bit difficult and doesn't stand the test of time. But any good product really performs a given task well and with consistency over time. And AI is no exception to that. It's subject to the same rule as any product. But AI has a particular advantage here in that I think it will be able to reach comparable knowledge to humans. And that will make it a profoundly stronger tool for humans to make better human decisions. And that's quite unique. That's where a lot of this potential, I think, comes from.
Yeah, well said. So, Mark, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would echo, both Yannick's and Dusty's comments. I mean, I think it comes down to a certain amount of education, right? I think it's important to educate around both what the AI is going to do for you, how it's going to help you, and its limits, right? I mean, like we said, it's an algorithm. It has limits based on all the things we discussed: training data and algorithmic complexity and deployment and all those sorts of things. I think in education, certainly from my experience of applying AI in clinical practice, with icometrics is really, their expertise, is really, if we go out and educate the radiologist and the neurologist around the value of this that it brings to them on a daily basis, as Dusty pointed out, just in terms of speeding things up and making them more efficient so they can have more hands-on time. So it really is about educating how AI is going to help them in their daily life, and to really give them a decent understanding of the limits of AI, but also how we go about validating those algorithms, right? Because certainly our software at Icometrics is FDA and CE cleared, so it has to go through a certain level of intense validation, and it's not making the decision, right? I mean, I think that's another point, right? Is be more progressive about it, right? Don't sort of say AI is going to replace the physician or the radiologist or the neurologist or the oncologist. To my earlier point, it needs to be seen as a progressive, journey together, where to Yannick's point, that the AI gets better and better. It's like having a colleague, right? that colleague gets better and better, and together you can do things that you couldn't do when perhaps you were postdocs or something like that. So I think it's that progression. It's education. It comes down to which you can use to build trust. It comes down to explaining the limits of AI, and it comes down to explaining also how the AI and the human and the clinician are going to work together to improve patient care and so on. So.
Yeah, really good points, Mark. I mean, I've heard this term. I've heard a new term used recently, and it was AI sidekick. And I have done some previous research as well, showing that 50 to 60, let's just say 50 to 60 drugs are released in a year. Out of those 50 to 60 drugs, does a physician actually know all of them and exactly what indications they should be used in versus other ones? And wouldn't it be nice to have, artificial intelligence, helping as well? But there seems to be just this overall belief that, AI could come and take their job. And I guess, Yannick, I'm going to come back to you again on this one. Do you think that AI has the possibility of taking people's jobs in healthcare, and if so, why?
I think that's all. I'm going to go that far and say this is a hard no. if we go back to the statistics you shared initially, the numbers, just the number of applications, how many jobs got created to make those? So I think this is a situation where how many it's comparable to when cars overtook horses. How many jobs have been created because of things that have wheels today? I think we're very early for that, but there are jobs now such as data annotators, data scientists, analysts, people that do quality control, people that are at the interface of any given domain that AI is used for, and quality control, and all of those others. There's just a mountain and an abundance of opportunity getting created because of AI, because it's a very simple way. It's a new tool, and new tools tend to find new use cases. Certain jobs will, as with all progress, will diminish. Probably not all the way, but I think we'll see an explosion around new jobs in AI that hasn't even begun to really happen yet.
Yeah. So Dusty, I mean, I kind of, I guess the next thought that I would have back to something else that I heard you say is that it almost seems to me like it would help physicians potentially elevate their game and become more personal overall. But you know, I don't want to put words in your mouth. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are.
No, as Mark said, AI could be your invisible friend. I think just like the colleague that gets better and better and better with time, right? So I think where AI needs to focus in the next 5 to 10 years is taking the drudgery and the busy work out from clinicians so that they have more value-added work that they can do and spend more time with the patients or doing research or whatever else they are not being able to do today because of the time they spend entering data into EMR systems, which essentially, is not leveraged in any shape or form for better outcomes or lowering costs. I think the quote I've often used is from Curtis Langlotz from Stanford when he was asked if AI is going to replace radiologists. And his answer was, well, that's a wrong question. The right answer is radiologists who use AI will replace radiologists who don't. And I think that's kind of what the future is going to hold. Because if you have an invisible friend that can help you up your game significantly, um, and your colleagues are all doing it, you'd be stupid not to use it.
Yeah.
Yeah, great points. And Mark, so we'll finish this one with you. I've got another follow-up for Dusty, and then one more question for Mark. And then I see that we've got one question from the audience so far. I'll bring up it towards the end. So Mark, any follow-ups in terms of, do you think that the AI will be taking the jobs, of physicians specifically? And if yes, why or why not?
No, I don't think it will. I think to all the points that Dusty and Yannick made, and that was a great comment. We saw it actually at a presentation also at RSNA, the comment about radiologists that don't use AI, will kind of fall into the background, as it were. I think they won't be taking our jobs. I think it creates new opportunities. It creates new opportunities to add more to healthcare workers and healthcare practitioners, more to what they can do, to speak to more to what they can do and advances from a career perspective, because they are using these performance enhancing tools, as it were, right, to do their patient care better. And that in the end is what we all want, whether it's an AI tool or a better way to enter data into an EMR, or a more streamlined phone system, so that when you call up for an appointment, you can actually get one. So in the end, it comes down to those sorts of things that are very human measures of how well my day went, how well my job is going, how well my career is going. I think that's where it'll come down to.
Yeah, absolutely. So,
We should never forget the human. Sorry, I was going to say we should never forget the human, right? In this thing, right? It's a partnership between the human and the tool.
yeah, it's the way it's one of those sort of things that's in the back of my mind. I'm obviously not an AI expert. I don't spend solely time in this space. However, the one thought I have is, how would artificial intelligence actually apply scientific principles and scientific thinking to things if it's not been trained, necessarily to consider all options. And so, to that point, I think there still is a need for the creative human mind to be involved in this process of, sort of helping to decide what happens with a patient in the end. So bringing us to the last question here. So what do you think of the rise of causal interference in general, now that 2 or 3 of the Nobel Prize in economics have gone to folks focused on this? And so, Dusty, I'm going to come back to you to start this one off, with us, overall to help kick off the question.
Yeah, it's exciting to see that in the field of economics, causal inference has become pretty popular. 2 of the last 3 Nobel Prizes going to people that have really used causal inference to come with some stunning conclusions of their research. Look, in the field of AI, causal AI has been around for a while. Julia Pearl wrote a book called The Book of Why almost 20 years ago, and called for greater transparency on AI algorithms at the beginning of this century. And I think we're just getting to a point where causal AI algorithms are coming into play, especially in the pharma world, in drug discovery, in biomarker discovery, in looking at new drug targets. Because when you're bringing together genomic data and clinical data, data from the EMR, the patient's phenotypical data, and you're trying to really come up with that network of disease that's going to help you understand complex advanced cancer better, you really need to know what's driving what kind of mutations in the DNA are driving, what kind of changes in the RNA expression, which is driving what kind of proteins. So if you don't understand the causal relationships between all these different elements, you just cannot get to the underlying circuitry of disease. And that's where I think a lot of the work that companies like GNS Healthcare, for example, are doing are going towards. And so it's exciting to see that a causal network like this could actually help you simulate an arm of a clinical trial. And you can do perturbations on that causal network to see the effect of drug A versus drug B, and see efficacy virtually. So you're creating what is essentially a digital twin of the patients. And I think that's where I see this moving, very quickly, because a lot of biosimulations companies are involved. And as Mark said at the beginning, we are in this age of this remarkable confluence of a lot of data. There's a lot of genomic data now. It's more than astronomical data. So think about it. It's more than social media data. We have more genomic data than either of the 2 entities, right, that I just mentioned. And then you have the computing power, unprecedented computing power that's available. And then instead of doing this black box deep learning AI, how about going into more of a causal AI where you establish cause and effect relationships? And at the convergence of a lot of these 3 things, I think we will see the next revolution coming in terms of simulating a virtual patient, going to more of a digital patient kind of a scenario where you can try different interventions. So I'm optimistic about about causal AI and what it can do to the world.
Yeah, so Mark, I'm going to come back. I'm going to come over to you because you and I have had discussions before about in silico, and the value of doing things, before, with AI, in silico versus doing it in person. So, how would you respond to this question?
I mean, I think again, it's not that causal AI is or explainable AI is a new thing, right? I mean, I remember applying fuzzy algorithms, back in the 1980s, where we established some rules, and then we used data to train those rules to make them better and discover rules from that data. I mean, that's the heart of neurofuzzy. That's like 1980s sort of engineering stuff. I think in the case of life sciences, explainability comes at two levels, right? It comes at the level, as we say, of when we're building a model or we're using machine learning to help us understand, a cancer pathway or a relationship between a chemical structure and activity at a target. That's where it can be really helpful to have causal explainability, because we want to understand which features are driving that, increased potency or why that biomarker might be useful. But in any science, even if we find a relationship, we want to go and test it, right? So I think the second part of explainable AI is what we do anyway, which is test that model that we have of reality actually works, right? In somewhat of a real world setting, or at least with training data that it's not seen before. So I think, along with explainable AI, which I think is very relevant in life sciences, goes frameworks to make sure we can validate these in the real world. We can validate their performance, just like because, I mean, to our conversations prior, right, we were developing models of tumors, right? So does, when you build a model of a tumor in silico, and you can test it, you can test it, but then you take that same information and you go to the real world, down to the lab, and you determine whether it worked or not. So to me,
Right.
it's two parts to the part of explainable AI, using it to explain how it works, but then also testing it in the real world, just exactly the same way you test any algorithm or any product or any assay or any genomic marker that you found by traditional methods, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. So with that in mind, Yannick, how about you? What are your thoughts in terms of kind of the impact overall on kind of the causal AI on the industry?
I think causal inference has a lot of potential, maybe in particular also in digital epidemiology. What if we can just model entire populations by learning from patterns that we observe, and can determine that these are actually interconnected in a real world, in a real world rationale? It's actually part of what we try to do at Symlotics, and we have some help through grammatical structures, because if someone describes a symptom and what it does, patients say, I can't do, or this symptom impacts me, my quality of life, because it does do X. And we develop systems to try to learn from that grammatical structure, so we have kind of an easier way than if you have to model everything from out of thin air. And this, to us, or to me, what gets me really excited is this has the potential to, at some point, turn this upside down and create these what-if scenarios. If we take a patient population, what are the 10 biggest impacts on their lives through the disease? And what can we do out of data, what we know, what can we do that remedies that attacks these burdens? And I think this is a really exciting opportunity based on determining causal relationships.
Very good. So there's two questions actually from Abdul Kader Ramo. The first one is, what is the legal framework that cushions the use of AI in medicine? I'm not an attorney, so I can't really answer this. I'm not sure if one of our panelists, will be able to answer this one, but if not, we could certainly table it. But
I can't, but I maybe I have some thoughts on this.
feel free.
We discuss a lot how to make AI better, but the foundational requirement, as Mark as you laid out so already, is data. So to an extent, I think we shouldn't just contemplate how to optimize algorithms, but also put energy and resources into into increasing data literacy and responsible governance. I actually in healthcare, I have yet to talk to a patient with a rare disease that would not share his or her data willingly for clinical research in a heartbeat. But patients have almost no active role in facilitating that, because to an extent they don't own or have in their hands their own data. But most people would actually probably share that willingly. I think this is something we should change. And this on a deep level, this touches obviously on legal constraints of what can you actually do with data that exists. And the reality is that for developing any AI system, there's no free lunch. So unless you have data, you won't get output. So this is just I think at the heart of a very important discussion that's ongoing, and that different countries also solve in different ways. We obviously have the German perspective on that tends to be quite rigorous. But unless I think it holds a lot of promise to give patients more control and more literacy over their own data.
I mean, I can't comment on the legal framework, but I mean, from a regulatory perspective, anything that's used in clinical practice has to be FDA or CE cleared. So, for example, our MRI software is cleared by FDA and CE as software as a medical device. Again, it's not making the final decision, but it's part of the clinical workflow. So it has to be go through those regulatory processes, and they're pretty intense. So I think that's part of it, right? Is that it's not a research use only tool. It's a FDA or regulatory approved tool. That speaks to the legal framework. But in terms of, I think what Yannick's touching on, which is patient consent, as it were, to share their data, and there's a whole there's a whole we could have several weeks of discussions around that, and maybe we probably should. I mean, I think you've seen with companies like 23andMe, but also patients like me, right? You've seen the desire for patients to share their data to advance therapies, and if we consider that drug discovery is a data-driven data-driven exercise, then the more data we can get from the widest possible compilation, to Dusty's point, is the right thing to do. So maybe that's the subject of our next podcast.
Yeah, and I think I think actually Abdulkader Ramo submitted a second question, which I think ties to that, and is there a preferred principled approach to AI, such as black box or no black box? And I think Dusty's sort of brought up this issue prior, that hey, look, sort of indicating where did the decision making come from? What sort of basis did you use? Was kind of one of the previous statements, but I don't know is there anything else anybody would like to add to that?
Yeah, again, everything doesn't have to have a causal AI algorithm behind it, right? I mean, if in radiology there could be applications where if you're diagnosing a lesion correctly with a black box and it's accurate 99.99% of the time, even if you don't understand exactly how it's being done, clinicians can use it, but use their judgment over that as well to diagnose the patient. So I think that's the key. The AI is not in charge. It's the clinician that's in charge. And I think that, but when you're talking about drug discovery and building this, network of complex disease and doing perturbations on those networks to do what if scenarios, as Yannick said, you absolutely need to understand the causal relationships. Otherwise, you're shooting in the dark, and it's pretty dangerous to do it without doing that.
Yep.
I mean, really, you want to understand it, right? I mean, I think that's the point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I have to say that from a regulatory perspective, also, is the FDA has been very good actually recently rolling out a whole set of guidelines around software as medical devices and machine learning algorithms, and I think it's. I was at a meeting a couple of weeks ago, and the FDA was there, talking about digital therapeutics and digital, diagnostics, and I think there's very much a drive from the FDA to come up with frameworks to allow the maximum amount of innovation in this area within the bounds of good regulation and good science in order to really reap the benefits of what AI could bring to healthcare.
Yeah, and it's really encouraging to see FDA also recognizing the value of leveraging RWE and real-world evidence, real-world data generated with AI, and using that as a virtual arm of a clinical trial, which is significantly going to shorten the time of doing clinical trials. Right now, we all know the statistics, right? It takes $2.8 billion to bring a drug to the market. It could take 12 years, and only 5% of the molecules you start with have, only 5 of them will make it at the end. So it's not sustainable at this point, at this rate, to continue on this journey. So something has to change.
Yeah.
So that's a perfect transition to my last question for this panel, which is, where should we expect to see AI next in healthcare? Where do you think it's going to lead us? I mean, the trends that I'm seeing are all pointing towards sort of this healthcare process automation, having this AI sidekick, patient monitoring kind of around, any sort of sickness and trends. COVID is a good example, maybe. That would be a great place to learn. But I'm just curious, and Mark, we'll start with you, sort of where do you think things are going to go next?
I thought about this when we were preparing for the, and I think, there's where I think it will go and where, it might have, maybe I'll rephrase the question, where do I think it'll have most benefit? Which is hopefully where it ends up going. But, I do think, to the points a lot of us made, earlier on, it really will go to the point where we can improve efficiency, right? Across the board. I think, healthcare processes, the process of delivering healthcare, in an advanced economy like the US or anywhere in Europe, it is really quite archaic in the way it's done, right? And I think there's opportunities for AI to smooth the care path, be that. And I don't think it's one AI solution. I think it's a combination, a sort of ecosystem of different tools that are impacting, say, if we take the neurological care path, right? So what I'm familiar with, in my current job, is really just improving the accuracy of scans, improving the number of scans that can be done, collecting patient-reported outcomes efficiently, using predictive modeling based on AI to indicate disease trajectories. All these things, they're small pieces of AI, but they applied across the care path, they can really, generate, most importantly, better outcomes for patients, but also cost savings, efficiency savings, reduction in cognitive load of the clinicians, reduction in nurse time, all these sorts of things. I think it won't be just one big thing, but it'll be pieces of AI that impact across the care path to improve that entire care path, where I would say we'd see it most used. But that's my opinion.
Very nice. Yeah, thank you so much for that. Dusty, how about you?
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with what Mark just said. I mean, reducing the drudgery of physicians, of nurses, uh, the stakeholders that are involved in the care pathway of patients. I think that is where I see AI going first. I also see AI going much beyond that in the next decade, and part of that is going to depend on how much data the AI systems are fed. So there are many aspects of data, right? You got Dr. Atul Butte at UCSF talks about the 5 V's of data, right? Volume, veracity, validity, value, and I think it's velocity of data. So I may be missing a couple. People have talked about the 7 V's of data now recently. Uh, so you got, unless you have these 5 or 7 V's of data, you can't do much with the data. So one of the trends that I see happening is this trend around federated learning, where you do decentralized machine learning from various centers, because one center may not have all the data. But if you can gather data from different servers and you have the algorithms, working through and crunching through data, de-identified data at different institutions, and institutions work collaboratively to have those 5 V's of data, that might lead to more robust and more trustworthy algorithms coming out. So I do see that as something that is going to happen and is happening. Recently I just saw Sanofi just put like $300 million in a company called Alkin that's trying to improve clinical trials and clinical development using federated learning. My friend from MGH, who's formed his own company, Itai Dion, called Rhino Health, just published a couple of publications on using federated learning on COVID data. So, you need to kind of integrate data from different centers, but do it in a way that, you are using de-identified data and you're not compromising the privacy of patients anywhere, but being able to use that data and to generate more robust algorithms is something that I see happening more and more. So I would say federated learning is going to be something that will be happening more and more in the future. And lastly, I think using causal AI where you can, especially in drug discovery, finding new targets, biomarker discovery, for coming up faster, with new drugs along the clinical trial development process, identifying subpopulations of response, in market access where you open up certain drugs to new drugs that are coming in, which might be more efficacious, and not doing a clinical trial, but being able to use in silico patients to do that. I do see that happening over the next 5 to 10 years in a big way, to reduce cost, to compress the time for bringing drugs to the market, and overall, improving the patient outcomes and lowering costs, which at this point are completely unsustainable.
Very good. And Yannick, last but not least.
I think it will be hard to add to that list. I think it's very comprehensive already. The way I like to think about this is there are 3 families of analyses. The first one is descriptive. I think a lot of the cost reduction opportunity is rooted in that. How can we harmonize data better? How can we make documentation better and just reduce friction into that entire system that generates more time and more value for physicians, hopefully more time to actually care for patients. I think there's a lot of opportunities as well in predictive analyses with an application for rare diseases. How much time do patients on average spend undiagnosed? I think there's a lot that can be done here to pick up markers that physicians can't pick up on because they have their narrow view, and it's easy to miss. There's so much complexity. And then I think the most sophisticated version, prescriptive, seeking outcomes from prescriptive analyses to throw a rock in the water and predict what will happen, which waves will happen, and how do they actually help people. This more, Dusty, as you said, this should help us to rule out drug candidates that won't make it earlier on. So just to balance the return of investment for clinical research, because that is getting unsustainable in many different ways. And simply by looking at what has already been touched with AI and what is still done the same way it's been done for 30, 40, 50 years, there's so much potential for improving that, that I think it will be a long while until we close this subject.
Absolutely. Well, I wanted to thank my guests, first of all. So thank you, Yannick, for being on. Mark and Dusty, thank you for being here. With regards to this episode, so it is viewable already on LinkedIn right now. It'll be continually viewable, there as a platform. It's on YouTube. It also is being broadcast on Twitter as well at this point. And so anybody could pick it up, on any of those three platforms. I'll be turning this into an audio podcast, and so there'll be an audio version of this podcast for people to listen to. But certainly, if you would like to see all of our faces, feel free to go back and look at the video as well. So thank you so much, to all three of you for your time today. I greatly appreciate it, and thanks for being on.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Life Science Success. For complete details about this podcast, including show notes, how to get in touch with guests, and more episodes, please visit www.lifesciencesuccess.com. If there's someone you'd like for us to invite to the show as a guest, please let me know by sending me a message at the podcast website. Please click subscribe on your favorite podcast app, share the podcast, or tell a friend about it, and last but not least, rate the podcast. Thank you again.